So, Rose Garden. It's a sit between Ruby and Oscar. Oscar was introduced 4 volumes later than Ruby, so of course Ruby would already be involved in other sips such as Lancaster, White Rose, and Nuts and Dalts. I can't say for certain who Ruby will be in a romantic relationship with, or if she will be in one at all. Only the writers do. However, I do really enjoy Ruby's and Oscar's interactions with one another. When Ruby and Oscar first meet, they are pretty friendly towards one another. However, it's not without hesitation. Both exclaim the weirdness of Oscar having 2 souls. Ruby is even unsure of how to talk to Oscar at first, as shown when she crosses her arms. However, the dojo scene is an important transition from this. Before we get into that scene, let's talk about Ruby. Her mentality is, I don't have time to look at my own emotions. I need to look at everyone else and take care of them. This is stated in the companion book, where it states Ruby's acts are selfless, but does not mean she is dealing with her own emotions. In Volume 4, she tries to look out for John and his team, and only until the end, she cries alone. It is for that reason Ruby tried to hide her sadness when remembering Penny's catchphrase. And Oscar, despite having his own fears, saw right through her, seeing her sad face and being reminded of the dangers that they were going through, allowed her to express herself. I did consider the scene between John and Ruby in Volume 4, but no long-term changes are built off from that scene afterwards. Most likely because John empowering Ruby is what he does for anyone else, and Ruby does not do anything differently, mainly serving as a reminder of what they learned at Beacon, specifically from what Osmond said to Ruby in Volume 1. For Ruby and Oscar, they never try to convince the other that they need to act or are as strong or as happy as they publicly appear. Instead, they accept the other wholly as they are, letting them be completely defenseless, as both give the sense of, it's okay. For example, Ruby giving the cane to Oscar shows how he has learned from their last talk, putting effort as he only speaks to counter Oscar's remarks instead of rushing in, cheering him up. Even her semblance itself represents her rushing through most things, and so for her to slow down a little for Oscar is a big indicator of her growing maturity. In the end, even though the memories are painful, Oscar listening and the two letting themselves be weak in turn with one another was important to Ruby, as shown in Volume 6. Out of all her memories of Oscar, not the training scene, not Oscar getting on the train to Argus, it was this one. The scene right after talking about her fears with Oscar, she focused on. This does not mean Ruby instantly crushes on Oscar, but instead, Ruby isn't constantly drawn to Oscar more so than she ever did with Osmond, thus learning to distinguish Oscar's mannerisms from Osmond's, while also being aware of Oscar's presence. This is shown such as when walking to Lionheart's place together, and during the train fight, where Ruby recognizes that Oscar is having trouble, even before Crow. That's why Ruby truly does support Oscar when she says that he is his own person. This plus other small factors, which we will get into detail later, lead up to Oscar surprising her with a comeback in Volume 6, resulting in Ruby having a small, quick but strong enough moment for Ruby to compliment his appearance. Of course, Ruby isn't really able to have a chance to think about being closer to Oscar because of everything else that is going on. Oscar hasn't been paired up on a mission with Ruby like Weiss, John, and Penny, so there's plenty more to come. It makes sense since Volume 6 was about Ruby making sure her team and her family stuck together, while Volume 7 was about her being with Penny, whom she thought was dead. Also, should Ruby and Oscar avoid multiple love interests, it should be easy for them to sort their feelings by looking at the moments they've had so far. Ruby influences Oscar more regarding his role in the plot, similar to Ren influencing Nora and Yang influencing Blake. When Oscar left his home, he didn't really have anybody to lean on. When he talked to Osmond, all he said was, I know it's crazy, but come on, let's go. That's not actually what he said, but that's what it felt like to Oscar. So when Ruby tries to copy Osmond and says something similar, he feels annoyed. However, after witnessing Ruby's empathy and understanding what she has been through, Oscar begins to admire Ruby. But more than that, he becomes constantly drawn to the state of happiness and of vulnerability within her great strengths, deeply invested in wanting to help. This is expressed more with Ruby trying to get Raven on their side, and Oscar being influenced to try and get Ironwood on their side as a result. However, in Oscar's case, it's more of him trying to prevent Ironwood from focusing simply and only on the results. This is more support for Ruby's role, which revolves around having the will to inspire hope within herself and others to change said reality into a brighter future, as emphasized when she inspires John's team in Volume 4 to make a difference, and stands up to the Apathy's influence in Volume 6. Might also be emphasized from the fact that Ruby's semblance allows her to change and split her form, thus never being constrained to one reality. So in other terms, Ruby strives for the future while Oscar is willing to accept that some things can't be ignored in the present. They are able to do this while growing bonds with other characters. Oscar was able to interact with Ozpin, Maria, and most recently John. As for Ruby, she does so with her team and Crow in Volume 6, along with Penny in Volume 7. Overall, Ruby goes into things quickly, especially when wanting to protect others, but can be patient sometimes when protecting others' feelings. Overall, Oscar is patient or steadfast with his actions, but can take quick risks in regards to what he wants. So I don't expect them to become a couple until maybe Oscar proactively influences Ruby, similar to Nora in Volume 4 and Blake in Volume 6. So despite their differences, Oscar and Ruby have commonality. Each of their emblems is based on someone else's. Ruby's with Summers and Oscar's with Ozpin's. There are even cases when the two worry about each other with pretty much the same gestures, basically mirroring one another. Even in a comedic moment involving Marrow's tail wagging, the very least shows the two can be in sync. This subject is pretty hard to know for certain, but with various examples, it leads me to believe the two are saying, "I like you," or "I feel the same." Of course, there are other parallels for Rose Garden regarding other Ruby sips. The parallel with Arcos would be that Ruby talks about Nora's appetite when inviting Oscar to dinner. This is similar to Pyrrha talking about Nora's appetite and inviting John to dinner in Volume 1. Another would be that both get angry at the other's abuse. Pyrrha pissed off at John's abuse from Cardin, Ruby pissed at Oscar's abuse, John pissed at Cardin's abuse trying to bully Pyrrha, Oscar pissed at Ruby being knocked out. So yeah, those are pretty much the main ones for Arcos. So for Renora, there is one scene in Volume 6 when Nora and Ren seek each other's reactions and Oscar seeks Ruby's. For Volume 7 though, there's a lot of parallels with Bumblebee. Bumblebee was also pairing Renora a lot in Volume 7 as well. Not to mention, like Bumblebee and Renora, Oscar and Ruby have complementary colors with one another, with Oscar's dark green going with Ruby's red, and Oscar's gold from his eyes complemented by Ruby's silver eyes. Of course, Oscar just has gold flecks. Even the relationship in the Ruby tale, Warrior of the Woods, for those of you who haven't read it, feel free to skip, but the relationship between the two main characters is similar to Ruby and Oscar's in that both the warrior and the boy character explain their reasons for what they are doing. The warrior explaining why she fights is similar to Ruby in Volume 5. The boy explaining why he cooked for the warrior along with other things similar to Oscar explaining why he came back in Volume 6. I honestly did not think about most of these parallels until looking back,